So, back in 2026, something happened that nobody thought was possible. After more than 2 decades of basically owning the skies, a U.S. fighter jet was shot down by enemy fire. This is the story of how the entire rulebook for air combat got torn up right over the deserts of Iran.
Okay, let's set the scene. The year is 2026. Tensions between the US and Iran are through the roof. We're talking open conflict. And on March 24th, the President of the United States makes this incredibly bold statement, basically painting a picture of total, absolute American dominance in the air.
But just 1 week later, 1 week, the whole narrative just shatters. An F-15E Strike Eagle and an A-10 Warthog are knocked out of the sky by Iranian air defenses. Suddenly, that confident rhetoric collided with a very, very harsh reality. Now, this wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a massive shock to the system. For the first time in a generation, American air power, something that was seen as invincible, suddenly looked, well, vulnerable. And it raised a question that had military analysts everywhere scrambling. How on earth did this just happen? I mean, to really put this into perspective, you have to understand it had been over 20 years since a U.S. fighter was lost to enemy fire. An entire generation of pilots had trained and flown believing in this idea of air supremacy, total uncontested control. And in an instant, that entire doctrine was thrown into question. So to really get how Iran managed to do this in 2026, we've got to rewind the clock a bit. The signs were there all along, especially in this one super tense standoff that happened 7 years earlier, back in 2019. It was, for all intents and purposes, a warning shot. On June 20th, 2019, Iran shot down this massive, very expensive American surveillance drone. And let me tell you, this single event brought the two countries right to the edge of all-out war. President Trump actually ordered retaliatory strikes, but then called them off with just minutes to spare, saying the potential loss of life wasn't worth it.
And what's really fascinating here is that this whole international crisis, this near war, it all came down to a few miles of disputed sky. You had the US saying one thing, Iran saying another. Each side had its own data, its own truth, but honestly, the exact GPS coordinates weren't the most important part of the story. The real story was the message Iran was about to send.
Right. So here's the kicker. It's not about what Iran did, but what they didn't do. An Iranian general later came out and said that a manned U.S. P-8 surveillance plane with 35 people on it was flying nearby. They claimed they had a lock on it, could have taken it down, but they chose not to. This was a message. It was them saying, look what we can do and look at the restraint we're showing. It was a warning. Okay, so how did Iran make that leap? How did they go from taking down a relatively slow, unmanned drone in 2019 to successfully hitting sophisticated, fast-moving fighter jets just a few years later? Well, the answer is all about mastering a very specific kind of warfare. Look, Iran knew it could never go toe-to-toe with the U.S. military. Not dollar for dollar, not plane for plane, it's just not possible. So instead, they got smart. They invested heavily in what's called asymmetric warfare. Basically using clever, unconventional tactics and tech to turn a superpower's strength into weaknesses. And a huge piece of this strategy was a major tactical shift. They got rid of their big, clunky, static air defense sites, the kind that are just sitting ducks for an airstrike. Instead, they switched to smaller, mobile missile launchers. They'd hide them in underground tunnels, in caves, out in the rugged mountains. And their whole doctrine was simple. Shoot and scoot. You pop out, you fire, and you get the heck out of there before the enemy can hit you back. Now, this whole doctrine was powered by a really smart mix of technology. They use systems that hunt for an aircraft's heat signature instead of using radar. That's a huge deal because it means they don't send out any signals for a pilot's warning systems to pick up. But the real secret sauce, the absolute game changer, was their ability to network everything, Russian systems, Iranian systems, short range, long range, into one big deadly web. And this table really shows you that strategy in action. See, it's not about having one single super weapon, not at all. It's about creating layers, like a deadly onion. You have the long-range systems that force enemy jets to fly lower to avoid them, but in doing that, they fly right into the kill zone of the short-range, infrared-guided ambush systems. They basically turned their airspace into a perfectly engineered trap. Of course, this conflict was never just about technology and tactics. The moment that F-15E was hit in 2026, the entire situation turned into a frantic, incredibly high-stakes human drama playing out deep inside enemy territory.
First off, just think about the financial loss. A single modern F-15E Strike Eagle costs around $100 million. That is a staggering amount of money for one piece of military hardware.
But that dollar amount, as huge as it is, just pales in comparison to the human cost. It's immeasurable. The second that jet went down, the mission changed completely. Forget tactics, forget strategy. The number one priority, the only priority, became finding and rescuing that two-person crew.
The rescue mission itself was unbelievably dangerous. You had American rescue helicopters flying low and fast into Iran, making themselves vulnerable to the exact same air defenses that had just proven they could take down a fighter jet. To make things even worse, Iranian state media put out a cash bounty for the pilot's capture, which turned the whole thing into a race against time. After a desperate, frantic search, they managed to successfully rescue one of the two crew members.
So, looking back, the events of 2026 were so much bigger than just the loss of a couple of planes and a dangerous rescue. What they really signaled was the potential end of an entire era of military thinking, an era that was built on the rock-solid belief in unchallenged American air power.
As one analyst, Behnam Ben Taleblu, put it so well, a disabled air defense system is not a destroyed one. Iran proved that even if your military is battered, you can still be weak but lethal. You don't have to match your enemy's power to hurt them badly. You just need the right strategy and the right tools.
And this brings us right back to that key idea. For decades, the U.S. operated with what's called air supremacy. That means total, utter control. The enemy just can't touch you. But what Iran demonstrated is that those days might be over. The skies are now contested. Now, the best you can hope for is air superiority, which is a much messier, much more dangerous reality, where you have some control, but risk is always, always there.
And that shift from supremacy to superiority changes everything. It means more risk for pilots, it means missions are way more complex, and it forces a fundamental rethink of how power works in global conflicts. It really leaves us with this one huge looming question for the future. If you can no longer take control of the skies for granted, what are the new rules of war?